Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. You might notice that I've got a brand channel now, so it's now called George from Ireland Reflections. But anyway, this video is about tensions between the United States and Iran, what's happening in the past few days, how it's changed, and how the United Kingdom is in danger of being sucked into this. So we all know that General Qasem Soleimani was killed about 10 days ago now, Iranian general in Iraq. He was part of the Iran's liaison to various pro-Iranian militias, Shia militias in Iraq. Most of them have a sympathetic relationship with the Iraqi government. And therein lies the rub. The United States is against ISIS. The Iraqi government is against ISIS. Iran is against ISIS. Now, you won't hear the Trump administration acknowledging this, but Iran, in one conflict, is an ally against ISIS. In other conflicts, it's an adversary. So the United States is not at war against Iran and actually never has been at war against Iran, ever. But there are certainly tensions, and some of these Iranian-supported militias, or terrorist groups, as the United States prefers to call them, launched attacks on the United States Embassy. I don't think they've killed any Americans in those attacks, but they've sometimes attacked U.S. troops in the region. There are about 5,000 American troops in Iraq, mostly in air bases. So the latest attack was on New Year's Eve. So then President Trump decided that General Soleimani was going to be killed, and indeed he was. Notice his surname ends with the letter I, as Iranian surnames almost invariably end. Reminds me, well, I once worked for a member of the former Iranian imperial dynasty, I shan't say whom, and he was very keen that Mitt Romney be elected because he wanted a war between the United States and Iran. Presumably this guy had fantasies of the family being restored. Well, that's not going to happen. And I don't think even the most demented hawk in the Trump administration wants boots on the ground, wants an actual occupation of Iran, because the United States extricated itself from Iraq several years ago without a great deal of glory. So there's no public appetite for that. But what was the reason for killing Soleimani? And people try to say, Trump supporters try to say he was a bad guy. Well, he was. The Iranian regime is a bad one. There's no doubt about it. It's not as horrific as the Saudi Arabian government, which the Trump administration praises to the moon. One which is really inflicted the most insupportable oppression on all sorts of people, on religious minorities, on women and so on. Eased up a little bit on women in the last year, being the last country in the world to allow them to drive. But whereas Christians and Jews can worship freely in Iran, they even have a Jewish representative in their majlis, their parliament and so forth. So, but there was no imminent attack. There was no particular reason to kill General Soleimani at this time, and that was really ramping up tensions. That was provocative, and you had to expect the Persians to hit back hard. So, anyway, it was really vengeance for what had gone before. And then Trump yet again showed these have got absolutely no regard for international law, threatening to deliberately target cultural sites, which is a war crime. You know, he's boasted he's going to commit war crimes all the time. He'd bring back far worse than waterboarding. He would deliberately kill civilians, and on and on and on. I mean, the man's a barbarian. I know some of America's foes do this kind of thing, which is also reprehensible. I vainly thought the United States was a civilized country, but Trump is eager that it should not be, because we'll have our war, people will get killed. We don't actually need to destroy national heritage, or really international heritage, things that UNESCO has protected. Where does that get us? I mean, would you rather they destroy the building or kill people? I suppose destroying the building isn't as bad, but what does it do for the furtherance of your cause? But anyway, Iran is already under severe pressure economically. People are shrieking, so they're definitely feeling some pain. It appears they attempted to hit back over the summer with attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, or the Arabian Gulf if you prefer. Now, maybe not the Iranians themselves doing it, but their proxies, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Not certain the Iranians did it, but I think it's probable. But this appeared to have a negligible effect on oil supply, so they're not hurting their enemies as effectively as you could. You'd think that Saudi Arabia would be an open goal. All these pipelines, all these refineries, you can't guard everywhere. You could blow up a lot. So obviously the Iranian riposte was some rocket attack on a US base, which I don't believe killed anybody, was a deliberately feeble response. Why are they being so weak? Perhaps they want to de-escalate, as indeed the Iranians do. They say that only Nixon could go to China. I don't wonder if only Trump could go to Iran a bit like him going to North Korea, and you see how that's worked out. Hasn't worked out. They haven't made any progress. I can picture him in a few months' time touching down in Tehran and calling the President Khamenei the great leader of a great country and a great people, and wouldn't Trump like to open Trump Towers all over the place, or inviting him to the White House or something. That sort of démarche is the kind of thing which should obviously have Republicans vomiting, but no, because it's him, they will forgive him well nigh all, despite his total impenitence. So just as though we thought the situation was calming down a little bit, something came along to very much disturb the tranquility. That Ukrainian civilian airliner shot down over Iran, 178 people killed, almost half of them Iranians. And there was much speculation. Was it a crash? Was it an accident? No, it was shot down by whom? It was fascinating to see Russian state media immediately leap to the conclusion that it was the United States shot it down. It was completely unfair to blame the Iranians, despite ample evidence that it was the Iranian government, as in you could tell, well, from where the missiles gone. There are all sorts of satellites will monitor these things. If you investigated the wreckage, you'd see what sort of missile shot it down, and it'd be pretty difficult to get an enemy missile that far over Iranian territory and blah, 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 without the Iranians intercepting it. And after a few days of vehement denials, Tehran acknowledged actually it was them who shot it down. Clearly a mistake. These things happen. The fog of war, especially if they're under attack. They've been under attack from the United States. They're generally shot down, expecting airstrikes, no doubt. They see a plane, they misidentify it, and they fire, but too trigger happy. And as everyone said, it's eerily redolent of what happened in July 2014 over the skies of eastern Ukraine, when the Russian 53rd Anti-Aircraft Brigade shot down MH17, that Malaysia Airlines plane flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. And of course, Russian state media in 2014 immediately bragging that the pro-Moscow rebels in Ukraine had shot down a plane. Yep, they were cock-a-hoop about it. They said it was a Ukrainian military aircraft. No doubt, in good faith, these pro-Russian militia, they believed it was a Ukrainian military plane. They wouldn't have shot down a civilian plane from a neutral country. There's no gain in it from that. We've got to ask cui bono. So, yes, they did a terrible thing, but I give them this. It was an accident, and mistakes happen. But they couldn't come clean about doing that. And actually, sorry, I should say, it was a Russian army unit that was operating in Ukraine, because obviously Russia invaded Ukraine 5.5 years ago, won't tell the truth about it, lied and lied and lied. In this conflict, it's killed 13,000 people. An international criminal investigation has described it as a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. The Russian government doesn't have the common decency to actually declare war, or even to tell the truth about it being at war, despite the fact that Ukrainian prisoners are taken to Russia, despite the fact that Russia is negotiating peace with Ukraine. How can you negotiate peace if you're not in a conflict? So the most flagrant lies are told almost non-stop, just unblushingly making these deceitful statements. I mean, there is no government quite as mendacious as the Russian government. I'm not anti-Russian one bit. Plenty of Russians I like, a little about Russian culture I admire, but the Russian government is absolutely nauseatingly dishonest. I'm not pretending other governments don't lie. My government lies. Not very often, not such whoppers of lies. We're not dealing in absolutes here. Everyone lies, present company included. It's a question of how frequently and how big are these lies. So the plane over Iran was shot down, and then obviously Russian state media and the Russian government was left looking very foolish when the Iranians mustered up the courage to fess up and say, actually, it was us, and it was in error, which of course it would have been. There's no gain for them to shoot down a Ukrainian civilian plane. Why would they possibly want to do that? They have normal diplomatic relations with Iran. Iran's got enough enemies, they don't need more, and actually half the people killed on board were Iranians. So, but then there have been large street protests in Iran. People are feeling the pinch, the economic pain. They remember the good years, only a couple of years ago, before the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was ripped up by President Trump when the economy was growing. It bounced back from sanctions. Then the British ambassador to Iran was arrested, which was a diplomatic outrage. There should have been more of a hoo-ha about that. Remember when a British diplomatic compound was invaded by an Iranian mob several years ago, and the UK lowered diplomatic relations to the lowest level, no longer had an ambassador chargé d'affaires, didn't actually break off diplomatic relations. And perhaps surprisingly, the UK was bolstered by outspoken support from other countries you wouldn't expect to be pro-British, like Russia and China, because they realize this is a worrying breach of the Vienna Convention. You simply don't barge into other people's diplomatic compounds. That's sacred, that's sacrosanct. Even in the Second World War, the German diplomats in Moscow were sent out via Turkey. The Soviet diplomats in Berlin were sent out by a neutral country, Turkey. They didn't do that. You simply don't do that. It's completely uncivilized. And I'll tell you why. If you're going to negotiate peace, you have to know your diplomats can go to parley safely, are not going to be kidnapped. Otherwise, they just become hostages. So the United States hasn't had diplomatic relations with Tehran since 1980, because remember, when their people were guests of the Ayatollahs for 444 days, when the United States Embassy was invaded by a mob and people were held hostage for all that time, and that put paid to the Carter administration. So the United Kingdom's had diplomatic relations with Iran for over 20 years, and they got a bit warmer. The ambassador was restored. They got a bit worse. I think the United Kingdom should actually push back harder and withdrawn the ambassador, gone back to having merely chargé d'affaires. But I think it was perhaps a mistake from the Iranians, because they're already reeling, and it's just made their isolation worse. Though they have reasonable relations with all their land neighbours, not with their maritime neighbour Saudi Arabia, they can scarcely afford to go provoking more countries. Now, there is no appetite for war in the United Kingdom. Besides that, the UK just has a military capability. The British Army is almost puny, only 80,000 soldiers, struggling to recruit and getting smaller all the time. The equipment might be quite good. So it just doesn't have the capacity to do that. But Boris Johnson, he's staying very close to President Trump, which no doubt Trump likes, having him as a wingman, and Boris Johnson signalling support for this. Even worse, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom saying there ought to be a Trump deal with Iran. Why on earth would anyone trust an absolute fraudster like Trump? I mean, a man whom the Washington Post has proven has made 8,000 deceitful or misleading statements on the record since he became president. 8,000 in under 3 years. It is mind-blowing. And why would anyone trust the United States when he's got this weather vane mind? The United States signed an agreement. It's not Obama personally, it's on behalf of the United States as a whole, and the incoming presidents will respect that. And you can't trust the United States to honour its word. So why should the Iranians do that? They made major sacrifices. They really reduced their uranium enrichment program. They abided by the deals of the letter. They were completely honourable and above board about that. It was signed off many times by international inspectors. President Trump himself twice extended the deal, extended by over a year. And when Trump walked away from the deal, why on earth were the Iranians bound by it? They weren't. America wasn't abiding by its obligations, so the Iranians were released from theirs. And they absolutely rightly started enriching uranium. So Iran is now closer to a nuclear bomb than it was before. It was closer than when Trump was abiding by the deal. So the United States has proved that its policy has been moronic. It's pushed Iran closer to having a nuclear weapon than it was before. So it's completely backfired in Trump's own terms. So a Trump deal, but why would they trust Trump? He's completely not trustworthy. They might want to tough it out for a year, and hopefully they get a better US president. But an incoming US president might say, ooh, I'll seem feeble if I go back to what we had before, to the Iran deal, as it's commonly called, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But what's going to happen? I remember 9 years ago, Trump saying that Obama would start this war against Iran. It would just be adventurism, simply try and help him get re-elected. And of course, President Obama didn't do so. He was very honourable. And now President Trump may well do what he accused the previous president of being about to do. But I think Tucker Carlson, who's his guru, he says, really, the American public don't want another war. This would not do well for you. I think dusting them with canister would do a bit of uptick in his ratings because he's tough. He's killed some brown people. And the fact that the Iranians didn't properly hit back will seem to redound to Trump's credit, as though his policy has paid off. He's given them a bloody nose and they dare not properly respond, that they are keen to return to relative tranquility. Because, of course, it is somewhat tense. They'd rather have a détente. They don't want to go to red war because they're suffering a lot. Anyway, I just really hope the United Kingdom doesn't get dragged into this. What I'm worried about is the United Kingdom is seeking to negotiate its long-term trade arrangement with the United States, and Trump will say, if you want a decent deal, you've got to give me military support against Iran. Not that the United States really need it. I mean, the US military is so much bigger than the British military, but it just looks good diplomatically to have more flags. It's a bit like, what's his name, Lyndon Baines Johnson wanting the British Army in Vietnam. It doesn't have to be a significant number of troops, just something, just so the United States doesn't look alone amongst Western countries fighting there. Had a few East Asian countries. Well, that's about it. What's going to happen? Well, I don't think any dramatic developments. It seems to be back to the normal old ding dong. Yes, knocking 7 bells out of each other. In Iraq, ISIS, the Shia militias, the Iraqi government on the same side, and Russia would quite like out of Syria, trying to see if they can have peace negotiations. They've been mired there, and there's a bit of friendly rivalry at this stage between the Iranians and the Russians about who's really got sway in Syria. The Israelis have this complicated relationship with the Russians, have to deconflict zones to avoid destroying the Russians when they're bombing Iranian targets there. So there's a very complex and unpredictable power play. I don't think there's going to be an all-out invasion of Iran. There might be some bombing raids and so on, but the Iranians are a hardy people. Yes, they're hurting. They're not fired by the same fanaticism that they had in the 1980s. That zeal has dissipated very considerably. Anyway, please follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and what else? So subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please book me for online lessons. Thank you for the donations on Patreon and PayPal. I need those to keep this channel going. Good night.